When Eric woke up, he was lying on a makeshift medical bed. The fact that all of his senses came back at once let him know that his amygdala had probably regenerated first. The fact that he felt fuzzy and anesthetized let him know that there were other neural structures waiting. Definitely his frontal lobe. He debated whether he should wait for it to stitch back together, or if he should get a move on things. The irony was that if he had a frontal lobe, it would have told him to wait. But he didn't, so his internal debate was entirely one-sided. He lurched forward, stopping after a few inches as his hands and ankles caught against chain. As he puzzled over the questions that raised, very difficult to do with maybe 60% of an intact brain, 6 Velders came into the room, waving little stun guns. That jogged his memory. Nothing like 6 green men waving stun guns to remind a man that he'd just survived getting shot in the head. He imagined they were very curious about how he'd survived that. The short answer to that was Henrietta Lacks, and the long answer involved several centuries of experimentation with modified cancer cells. But the real story was that it was proprietary human information not to be taken from his bloodstream without his express consent. Thank you very little. In theory, he could have said this, but it was a lot faster to just pull on the chains until the bones in his hands and feet shattered into pieces small enough to slip out. That process was almost instantaneous. "Shit," said 6 simultaneous Velders, confirming that Eric's translator still worked. "Ah!" said Eric, confirming that his vocal cords still worked. He liked that noise. He kept making it until he felt the cords snap like tiny little rubber bands. Blood bubbled over his lips as he fruitlessly tried to force more sound out. It took them about a second to regenerate, which gave him enough time to inhale and start it again. One of the guards hit him with the stun baton, which was just silly, barely tickled. He grabbed the baton with one mostly recovered hand, and felt his muscles tense enough to bite into the metal tube, then casually reached out with the other, and grounded himself through his opponent's arm. Now they were both getting the shit shocked out of them, which for Eric was barely an inconvenience, but for the Velders was probably the worst thing that had ever happened to him in his entire life. Eric's "Ah!" reached its full fever pitch, aided by the electrical shock, before stopping as his vocal cords snapped again. He coughed, and a fine splatter of blood flecked the guard's face. It sizzled, or maybe that was just the skin on his palm. Either way, it was a noise that he had developed a strong positive association with several hundred packs of bacon ago. Eventually the battery gave out, and the Velders went down like all its bones had turned to gelatin, which was plausible, come to think of it. There had been quite a bit of juice in that little lightning stick. With that issue out of the way, Eric looked around for the next 5 guards, and was disappointed to see that they had left the room and locked the door behind them. Like the electricity, his disappointment was a fairly powerful thing, and it was looking for something to ground itself in. The nightstand by the bed made for as good a grounding rod as any. Eric cut loose, hurling the thing around the room like a baseball. It wasn't that he was really that much stronger than the standard human. It was that he really didn't have to give a damn about whether he hurt himself. The bones in his hands and feet had gone from being pulpy messes to structured tools in all of a minute, and new pink skin was already pushing up through his palms, where he held the baton. And now, as he pulled every muscle from his quads to his shoulders, throwing that stupid nightstand around, they were already weaving back together. Eventually, all the plastic broke off the damn thing, which left him with a rough chunk of metal maybe 1.5 feet long. He liked that metal chunk. He'd probably have kept playing with it, but he remembered that there were 5 people with weapons, waiting to jump into the room again. Playing with scrap metal before fixing that was a bit like eating dessert before dinner. He threw himself at the door. First impact shattered his collarbone, but that was just a normal morning for him. Stupid thing was his own little wishbone, mainly in the sense that he had to break it every time he had a wish. Third impact smashed his arm in. Fourth, his jaw. Sixth and seventh just smeared a lot of blood down the door. Now that was an inconvenience. His body was amazing at recycling matter, but only so long as it remained internal. Anything that left only got back in if he ate it, which was just so... bleh. Maybe if he was younger, the whole melodrama of licking himself off the door might have been appealing, but this was something he just wanted to move on with. It was faster to just sit down and wait for his bones to knit back together. He started humming at that time, but that got boring, so he went back to his endless, blood-curdling scream. It was a good way to pass time. When he felt the two ends of his humerus slide back together, he dusted himself off, walked calmly to the far side of the room, got a running start, and held himself through the door. He managed to strip the bolts holding the hinges on, which left him standing in a hallway with more like 10 guards than 5. Apparently they managed to get some reinforcements while he had his tantrum. He noted that 2 of those reinforcements had guns. Both dumped their magazines into him, which he was fine with. Guards are trained for body shots. Soldiers are too, actually, but they eventually realized that headshots are the only thing that mean a damn when fighting HeLa mutants. Something like 16 bullets went for his torso, and the amount of blood on the floor implied that he would either have to eat 3 or 4 rare steaks, or do an absolutely lesbian amount of licking afterwards. Then they ran out of bullets. There was an awkward pause where they looked at him, and he looked at them. And then they looked at his foot and a half-long spike of scrap metal, and he looked at his foot and a half-long spike of scrap metal. And it might have just been the brain damage, but he could swear that he literally saw the light bulb turn on over his own head. He charged the first Valdus and ran him through easily. There was a lot of yelling, and he wanted to like it, but the Valdus refused to harmonize with him, and the whole style of the yell just felt bad. He'd have corrected the other man on his terrible yelling style, but he went quiet after a bit and flopped over, which meant there was more room on the spike. He swung the thing pretty hard and flung his first victim off. There was a good arc from the man's body, very math, and he admired it in a sort of offhand way, as he dive-tackled his second victim. "Ah!" said the second Valdus. "Pretty good," said Eric. It was harmonized, at least. Eric's right hand was busy holding a sharp piece of metal, and his left hand was busy holding his body up. If he was a little bit smarter, he'd have remembered that he was using the sharp piece of metal as a weapon. Instead, he slammed his forehead down onto the Valdus hard enough to crack his own skull. The Valdus went silent, which was tragic, but you can't make an omelette without burning a few bridges. Or something. Eric wasn't big on idioms. A third one swung the baton into his skull like a bat. If he hadn't just cracked the damn thing, it wouldn't have mattered, but they were getting dangerously close to messing with his brain again. That little bastard took days to glue itself back together. A fourth one was closing in behind, following on the same goal as number 3. He was very lucky that they were thinking to try headshots only after running out of bullets. Still, it was enough to convince Eric to pivot in his strategy. Gratuitous violence was easy, and, yes, fun, but perhaps not workable when outnumbered this far. There was a certain virtue in running away to fight another day, and Eric liked to think of himself as a very virtuous man. It was certainly easier than admitting that his personality was the reason he hadn't gotten laid in close to a year. There was also a window just 6 feet away down the hall, and it seemed like a very convenient exit. Without much thought, Eric leaped through it, gambling on the fall being less than 10 stories. A gymnast might have found a way to roll into the fall and distribute the force, but Eric's strategy was to sacrifice anything, so long as it protected the brain. That meant he fell down ramrod stiff, hands at his sides, until he hit the ground 60 feet below. It was, unfortunately, concrete, so where there were once 2 knees, there were at least 6. A small part of him noted that this was enough to be 1.5 horses. A larger, smarter part of him focused on speeding his recovery along by manually setting the broken bones. He was already hobbling along before the first guard came out the ground door, and was at a dead sprint by the time the second was out. After that, they'd have needed some kind of aerial vehicle to catch up with him. Not that they really wanted to. Their big step, too, had been to get a blood sample for testing, and he'd been kind enough to leave 2 large puddles in the hospital. Dr. Banach looked at the slide carefully. The baseline biology of the human seemed robust enough. Those white blood cells were ferocious, but it was the little triangular cells that fascinated him the most. As he watched, one underwent mitosis, splitting once, twice, 3 times, 4. All in under 30 seconds. "Ha," he said. "That's troubling."